The words hit me like a slap across the face, right there at my own Thanksgiving table, surrounded by 37 family members. "When are you moving to a nursing home, Margaret?" my daughter-in-law Jessica asked, her voice dripping with fake concern as she carved the turkey I had spent 2 days preparing. "I mean, you're 73 now. Don't you think it's time?" The entire dining room fell silent, forks suspended mid-air, and I felt my chest tighten as every pair of eyes turned toward me, waiting for my response. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my family story from. I want to know how far this has reached. My name is Margaret Helen Davies, and I've been living in the same house in Sacramento for 47 years. It's a beautiful Victorian home on Maple Street, with a wraparound porch and a garden that took me decades to perfect. My late husband Thomas and I raised our 3 children here, Robert, Michael, and our youngest, Christopher. The house holds every memory of our life together, from first steps in the hardwood hallways to graduation parties in the backyard. But on this particular Thanksgiving, November 23rd, 2023, everything I thought I knew about my family was about to change forever. The morning had started like every other Thanksgiving for the past 15 years. I was up at 5:30 in the morning, preparing the 22-pound turkey that would feed everyone. The kitchen smelled of sage and butter as I worked, humming the same songs Thomas used to whistle while he helped me set the table. The dining room looked perfect. My grandmother's china gleaming under the chandelier, the centerpiece of autumn leaves and pumpkins that I'd carefully arranged the night before, and enough chairs borrowed from neighbors to seat everyone comfortably. Jessica had married my son Robert 8 years ago, and from the very beginning, she made it clear that she considered me an inconvenience. She was 34 then, a real estate agent with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Robert was so smitten with her that he couldn't see how she treated me when he wasn't looking. The eye rolls, the heavy sighs, the way she'd check her phone whenever I spoke. But today, in front of the entire family, she had finally said what I knew she'd been thinking all along. "I'm serious, Margaret," Jessica continued, setting down the carving knife with more force than necessary. "This house is way too big for just one person. You could fall down those stairs or have a medical emergency and no one would even know. Wouldn't you be happier somewhere with people your own age? Somewhere with activities and medical care right there?" My daughter-in-law always had a way of making her cruelest suggestions sound like acts of kindness. She spoke in that soft, patronizing tone that people use with children or the elderly, as if I couldn't understand the implications of what she was really saying. She wanted me gone. She wanted my house. And she was using Thanksgiving dinner, surrounded by my children and grandchildren, to humiliate me into agreeing. Robert, my eldest at 51, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but said nothing. Michael, 47, studied his plate as if the pattern on the china held the secrets of the universe. Christopher, my baby at 43, cleared his throat but couldn't seem to find any words. My 3 sons, the boys I had raised to be strong and principled, sat there in silence while their father's memory seemed to fade from the very walls around us. "Mom always manages just fine," Christopher finally mumbled, but his voice carried no conviction. He lived in Denver now, only visiting twice a year, so what did he really know about my daily life? Does she, though? Jessica's voice grew sharper, her mask of concern slipping slightly. "When's the last time any of you really looked around this place? The gutters need cleaning, the paint is peeling, and those stairs are a death trap. She's going to break her hip one of these days. And then what? We'll all be running around trying to take care of her when we have our own families to worry about." My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my water glass. This was my home. These were my children. This was supposed to be a day of gratitude and family togetherness, not a tribunal where my future was being decided without my consent. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were, preparing to give thanks, while my daughter-in-law was essentially giving me an eviction notice. The thing is, I had been managing just fine. Better than fine, actually. Every morning I still walked 3 miles around the neighborhood, stopping to chat with Mrs. Peterson about her rose garden or helping young Mrs. Chen carry her groceries up her front steps. I drove myself to the grocery store, to church on Sundays, to my book club meetings every other Wednesday. My doctor, Dr. Harrison, had just given me a clean bill of health at my annual checkup 6 weeks ago. "You're in better shape than patients half your age, Margaret," he'd told me with a smile. But Jessica saw what she wanted to see. Or rather, she saw what would benefit her most. I had noticed her interest in my house growing over the past year. She'd started making comments about the potential of the property, how much it might be worth in today's market. Houses like this are selling for over $800,000 now, Margaret, she'd mentioned just last month, running her fingers along the original crown molding in the living room. Can you imagine? All that equity just sitting here. Now, watching her address my family like a real estate agent presenting a business proposal, I understood exactly what this was about. This wasn't concern for my well-being. This was a calculated move to get me out of a house that she saw as her inheritance. The Sunset Manor is really lovely, Jessica continued, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her topic. I drove by there last week, and they have such nice activities. Bingo on Tuesdays, craft time, even a little library. You'd make so many friends, Margaret. You must get lonely here all by yourself. Lonely. The word stung because it held just enough truth to hurt. Since Thomas passed away 3 years ago, the house did feel emptier. I did miss having someone to share my morning coffee with, someone to tell about the cardinals that nested in the oak tree every spring. But lonely didn't mean helpless, and it certainly didn't mean I was ready to give up my independence. I'm not lonely, I said quietly, my voice barely carrying across the table. This is my home. But Mom, Robert finally spoke up, and my heart sank at the tone of his voice. He sounded like he was reasoning with a stubborn child. Jessica has a point. We all worry about you here alone. What if something happened? What if you fell and couldn't get to the phone? I wanted to remind him about the medical alert necklace I wore, the one he'd given me for Mother's Day 2 years ago. I wanted to tell him about Mrs. Peterson, who checked on me every evening when she walked her little terrier. I wanted to explain that being alone wasn't the same as being abandoned, that I had built a life here that was meaningful and full. But looking at his face, at the way he avoided my eyes, I realized that my eldest son had already made up his mind. The kids think it's a great idea too, Jessica added, gesturing toward my grandchildren. 16-year-old Emma was texting under the table, completely oblivious to the conversation that was dismantling my life. 12-year-old Jake was playing some game on his phone. My granddaughter Sarah, Robert and Jessica's 21-year-old, was home from college and seemed to be the only one paying attention, though she looked deeply uncomfortable. We didn't actually, Sarah started to say, but Jessica cut her off smoothly. Sarah was just saying yesterday how worried she is about Grandma Margaret living here alone. Weren't you, sweetie? The poor girl's cheeks flushed red. She glanced between her mother and me, clearly torn between loyalty and honesty. I worry sometimes, but see? Jessica smiled triumphantly. Even the grandchildren can see it makes sense. And think about it, Margaret. No more worrying about maintenance. No more big heating bills in the winter. No more mowing that huge lawn. You could just relax and enjoy yourself. What she didn't say, but what hung in the air like smoke from a cooking fire, was what would happen to my house. Would Robert and Jessica move in immediately? Would they sell it and split the money between the 3 boys? Would they renovate it, paint over the growth charts I'd marked on the kitchen doorframe, tear out the garden where Thomas and I had planted our first tomatoes? I looked down at the turkey on my plate, the same recipe I'd been making for 4 decades, and suddenly I couldn't taste anything. The stuffing felt like sawdust in my mouth, and the cranberry sauce that I'd made from scratch seemed bitter. Around me, conversation gradually resumed. Michael was telling Christopher about his new job. Jessica was planning the next day's shopping expedition. The grandchildren were debating which movie to watch later. Life was moving forward as if the last 15 minutes hadn't happened, as if my entire future hadn't just been casually rearranged between the turkey and the sweet potato casserole. But there was something they didn't know, something I hadn't told anyone, not even my sons, a secret that would change everything. 3 months ago, I had received a phone call that turned my quiet life upside down. It was a Tuesday morning in August, one of those perfect summer days when the light streaming through my kitchen windows made everything look golden and warm. I was watering my tomatoes when the phone rang, and something about the formal tone of the caller made me set down my watering can and really pay attention. Mrs. Davies, this is Jonathan Bradley from Bradley, Harrison & Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Harold Jameson. The name meant nothing to me at first. Harold Jameson. I repeated it in my mind, searching through decades of memories, trying to place it. Then it hit me. Uncle Harry, my mother's brother, the one who had disappeared from family gatherings when I was still a teenager. The uncle who had gone to California to make his fortune and never came back, not even for my mother's funeral 15 years ago. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bradley, but I think there's been some mistake," I had told him, sinking into my kitchen chair. "I haven't spoken to Harold Jameson in probably 40 years. We weren't close. Nevertheless, Mrs. Davies, you are listed as his sole beneficiary. Mr. Jameson passed away in June, and his will specifically names you as the inheritor of his entire estate." The words seemed to float around my head without really landing. Sole beneficiary, entire estate. It felt like something from a movie, not something that happened to 73-year-old widows who spent their mornings watering tomatoes and their evenings reading mystery novels. "What exactly does that mean?" I had asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It means, Mrs. Davies, that you have inherited approximately $33 million, along with several properties in California and Nevada. Mr. Jameson was quite successful in real estate development. He never married, never had children, and according to his attorney's notes, he always felt guilty about losing touch with the family. This was his way of making amends. $33 million. The number was so large it didn't even seem real. I had never seen that much money written out, let alone imagined owning it. Thomas and I had lived comfortably on his teacher's pension and my part-time job at the library. But we had never been wealthy. We counted coupons and waited for sales and felt proud when we managed to save enough for a weekend trip to Lake Tahoe. The lawyer, Mr. Bradley, had been kind and patient as he walked me through the paperwork. There were bank accounts, investment portfolios, rental properties, and something called a trust fund that I didn't even pretend to understand. He assured me that everything was legitimate, that the taxes had been handled, and that the money was mine, free and clear. "What should I do with it?" I had asked him during our second phone conversation. "That's entirely up to you, Mrs. Davies. You could invest it, spend it, give it away, or simply let it sit in the bank. My only advice is to take your time deciding. This kind of money can change relationships with family and friends, so you might want to think carefully about when and how you share this information." His warning had proven prophetic. Over the past 3 months, I had thought about telling my sons dozens of times. Every Sunday after church, every phone call, every visit, the words had been right there on my tongue, but something always held me back. Maybe it was the memory of how they had acted when Thomas died, the way they had gone through his things so quickly, dividing up his tools and books and watch collection with an efficiency that had broken my heart. Or maybe it was the way Robert had started talking about my house as an asset and my future as a financial burden. Now, sitting at my Thanksgiving table and listening to Jessica discuss my living arrangements like I was a piece of furniture to be relocated, I was grateful for my silence. "You know what?" Jessica was saying, warming to her subject as she served herself another helping of green bean casserole. "I could drive you to Sunset Manor next week. Just to look around? No pressure. I bet once you see how nice it is, you'll change your mind about the whole thing." The presumption in her voice, the casual way she was planning my life, made my jaw clench. She spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if my preferences were just minor obstacles to be overcome with the right amount of persuasion and social pressure. "That's really not necessary." "Jessica," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, but I insist." She beamed at me across the table, her smile bright and sharp as a knife. "It's the least I can do for family. And honestly, Margaret, you'll thank me later. These places have waiting lists, you know. We need to get your name down soon if you want a good room." The conversation around the table had grown quiet again, my family members shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Even little Jake had looked up from his phone, sensing the tension in the air like an animal sensing a storm approaching. "Mom," Michael finally said, his voice gentle but resigned. "Maybe it wouldn't hurt to just take a look. Jessica's right about the waiting lists. My middle son, the one who had always been my peacekeeper, the one who used to crawl into my lap when his brothers were fighting and whisper, 'Make them stop being mad, Mama.' Now he was 47 years old with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes, and he was asking me to consider giving up my home because it was easier than standing up to his sister-in-law. "I don't want to look," I said, and for the first time all day, my voice carried some steel. "I don't want to move to Sunset Manor or anywhere else. I want to stay in my own house, in my own bedroom, with my own things around me. Is that really so unreasonable?" The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Jessica's smile flickered for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "Well," she said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, "I suppose we can't force you, but you have to understand, Margaret, that we won't be able to help you when things go wrong. When you fall down those stairs, or forget to pay a bill, or can't drive anymore, you'll be on your own. We all have our own families to think about." There it was, the threat underneath all the false concern. "We won't be able to help you. You'll be on your own." As if their help was something I should be grateful for, something I should be willing to trade my independence to keep. I looked around the table at the faces of my family. Robert was nodding slowly, as if Jessica had just made a particularly reasonable point. Christopher was cutting his turkey into smaller and smaller pieces, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Michael kept glancing between me and his wife Carol, who was studying her cranberry sauce with the intensity of someone trying to decode ancient hieroglyphics. The grandchildren seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of the conversation. Emma was still texting, her fingers flying across her phone screen. Jake had returned to his game, the electronic sounds barely audible but somehow managing to fill the silence. Only Sarah seemed truly uncomfortable, her eyes darting between her mother and me with something that looked like sympathy. "You know what I think the real problem is?" Jessica continued, apparently taking my silence as permission to elaborate on her theory. "I think Margaret is afraid of change. It's understandable at her age. But sometimes we have to do things that scare us, especially when they're for our own good. At my age." The phrase hung in the air like the smell of something burning, as if being 73 automatically made me incapable of making rational decisions about my own life. As if my years of experience, of raising children and managing a household and taking care of Thomas through his final illness, counted for nothing. I thought about Uncle Harry, about the conversation I'd had with his lawyer just last week. There had been more details to sort through, more paperwork to sign, more decisions to make about the properties in California. The rental income alone was more than I had ever made in a year working at the library. There was a beach house in Santa Barbara, a condominium complex in Las Vegas, and stocks in companies I'd never heard of, but that apparently paid dividends every quarter. "The thing is," I said slowly, setting down my fork and looking directly at Jessica, "I'm not afraid of change. I'm afraid of making the wrong change for the wrong reasons." Something in my tone must have caught her attention because she actually stopped talking and looked at me with genuine focus for the first time all evening. "I've lived in this house for 47 years, I continued, my voice growing stronger. "I've raised 3 children here, buried my husband from this living room, and built a life that makes me happy. Now you want me to throw all of that away because it would make things more convenient for you." "That's not fair, Mom," Robert interjected, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I asked, turning to face my eldest son. "When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Not to ask if I needed help with something, not to tell me about some problem you thought I should be concerned about, but just to talk? When was the last time any of you visited without an agenda?" The question caught him off guard, and I watched him mentally flip through recent conversations, recent visits, trying to find an example that would prove me wrong. The fact that it was taking him so long to think of one was answer enough. "We care about you, Mom," Michael said quietly. "We just want what's best for you." "No," I said, and the word came out more forcefully than I had intended. "You want what's easiest for you. You want to be able to tell yourselves that you're good sons without actually having to do anything that requires effort or sacrifice. Moving me to a nursing home isn't about my safety or my happiness. It's about your peace of mind." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the uncomfortable pause of people trying to think of something diplomatic to say. This was the shocked silence of people who weren't used to being called out on their behavior. Jessica recovered first, her face flushing with what I recognized as carefully controlled anger. "I think you're being very unfair, Margaret. We're trying to have a reasonable conversation about your future. And you're acting like we're the enemy. Are you?" I asked simply. The question seemed to hang in the air above the turkey and the sweet potatoes and the perfectly arranged centerpiece that I had spent an hour creating that morning. "Are you my enemy?" It was a question I never thought I would have to ask about my own family, but here we were. Emma finally looked up from her phone, sensing that something significant was happening, even if she couldn't quite grasp what it was. Jake had paused his game, his small face serious as he looked back and forth between his parents and his grandmother. Sarah was biting her lower lip, a habit she'd had since she was a little girl whenever she was upset. "That's enough," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority he used in business meetings. "This isn't helping anyone. Mom, we love you, and we're worried about you. Jessica is just trying to look out for your best interests." "Jessica is trying to get me out of my house," I said, and for the first time all day, I felt completely calm. The secret I had been carrying for 3 months felt lighter somehow, as if sharing even a small part of the truth had eased some invisible burden. "That's a horrible thing to say," Jessica snapped, abandoning any pretense of sweetness. "I have spent hours researching facilities for you, calling places, asking about availability. I could be spending my time on my own family, but instead I'm trying to help you, and this is the thanks I get?" I looked at her across the table. This woman who had married into my family and somehow appointed herself as the decision-maker for my future. Her face was flushed now, her carefully applied makeup showing stress lines that her usual composure kept hidden. For the first time, I saw her clearly, not as Robert's wife or the mother of my grandchildren, but as someone who saw me as an obstacle to something she wanted. "I never asked for your help," I said quietly. The words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her mouth opened and closed twice before she managed to speak. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Fine. Stay in this big old house all by yourself, fall down the stairs, have a heart attack in your garden. Don't come crying to us when you need help, because we won't be available." "Jessica," Robert said, a warning in his voice, but it was too late. The mask had slipped completely, and we all saw exactly what she really thought of me. But instead of feeling hurt or frightened by her words, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt powerful. "You're right, Jessica," I said, my voice steady and calm. "I might fall down the stairs. I might have a heart attack in my garden. But you know what? Those are my stairs, and it's my garden. And if that's how my story ends, then at least it will end in the place I chose to be." I stood up from the table, my legs steadier than they had been all day. The movement seemed to surprise everyone, including myself. For the past hour, I had felt like a defendant in my own home. But suddenly I remembered that this was my house, my table, my family gathered around it. "I think," I continued, looking around at each of their faces, "that you've all forgotten something important. You've forgotten that I wasn't always your mother, or your grandmother, or your mother-in-law. Before I was any of those things, I was Margaret Helen Morrison. And I was the kind of woman who moved across the country with a man she loved, who learned to drive when most women my age were afraid of cars, who raised 3 boys mostly by myself while their father worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat." The silence was complete now. Even the electronic beeping from Jake's game had stopped. I was the woman who held this family together when Robert broke his arm falling out of the apple tree, when Michael had pneumonia and almost died, when Christopher got arrested for underage drinking and needed someone to pick him up from the police station at 2 a.m. I looked at each of my sons as I spoke, watching recognition dawn in their eyes. I was the woman who took care of your father through 3 years of cancer, who made every doctor's appointment, who slept in a chair next to his hospital bed, who held his hand when he died. My voice caught slightly on those last words, but I didn't let it break. Thomas had been gone for 3 years, but the grief still lived in my chest like a heavy stone. "So when you tell me that I can't take care of myself," I continued, "when you suggest that I'm too old or too frail or too confused to make decisions about my own life, I have to wonder if you're talking about the same woman who raised you." Robert shifted in his chair, and for a moment I saw the little boy he used to be, the one who would come to me with scraped knees and broken toys, sure that Mama could fix anything. "Mom," he said softly, "we know you're strong. We know everything you've done for us, but things are different now. You're older, and what? And suddenly everything I've learned in 73 years doesn't count? And all the wisdom I've gained from raising children and burying my husband and surviving every crisis this family has faced means nothing because I have gray hair and reading glasses?" I walked to the window and looked out at the garden that Thomas and I had planted together, now dormant in the November chill, but still beautiful in its own way. The bare branches of the apple tree caught the late afternoon light, and I could almost see my boys as they used to be, racing around the yard, their laughter filling the air. "There's something else you've all forgotten," I said, turning back to face them. "You've forgotten that I have choices. You're all so busy making plans for my future That you've assumed I don't have any plans of my own. Jessica leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. What kind of plans? I almost smiled at the suspicion in her voice. Here was a woman who was used to being 3 steps ahead of everyone else, who prided herself on knowing all the angles, all the possibilities. The idea that I might have information she didn't possess clearly unsettled her. Well, I said, moving back toward the table but not sitting down. For starters, I've been thinking about doing some traveling. I've always wanted to see Europe, and now that I don't have to worry about leaving Thomas, there's really nothing stopping me. This was true, actually. The inheritance had opened up possibilities I had never dared to imagine. I could go to Paris, to Rome, to London. I could stay in Nice hotels and eat in good restaurants and see all the places that had only existed in the travel magazines I checked out from the library. Traveling? Christopher looked genuinely surprised. Mom, you've never mentioned wanting to travel. I've mentioned it plenty of times, I replied. You just weren't listening. Last Christmas, when we watched that movie about the woman who goes to India, I said I would love to see the Taj Mahal someday. And when Carol showed us those pictures from her trip to Ireland, I told you how beautiful it looked. But you all just smiled and changed the subject, like it was a sweet but impossible dream from a silly old woman. Carol, Michael's wife, blushed and looked down at her plate. She remembered. But Mom, Michael said carefully, traveling is expensive. And at your age, with your health, my health is fine, I interrupted. Dr. Harrison says I have the constitution of someone 20 years younger. And as for the expense, I paused, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. Well, that's not really a concern anymore. Jessica's fork clattered against her plate. What do you mean it's not a concern? Margaret, please tell me you haven't been scammed by one of those travel companies that target seniors. You know they prey on... I haven't been scammed by anyone, I said firmly. I've just had a change in my financial circumstances recently. A significant change. The room went very quiet. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the sound that had marked time in this house for decades. I could hear Jake's shallow breathing, Emma's phone buzzing with another text message, the settling of the old house around us. What kind of change? Robert asked, his voice careful and controlled in the way it got when he was trying to manage a situation he didn't understand. I looked at each of them again. These people I loved despite everything. These complicated human beings who were my family. I thought about the conversation with Mr. Bradley, about the bank statements that arrived in plain white envelopes, about the rental income checks that were more money than Thomas and I used to make in 6 months. The kind that means I can take care of myself for the rest of my life without being a burden to anyone, I said. The kind that means I can hire help if I need it, make modifications to this house if necessary, or even buy a different house if I decide I want a change of scenery. The kind that means I have choices, real choices, about how I want to spend whatever time I have left. Jessica was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was part confusion, part suspicion, and part something that looked almost like fear. Margaret, she said slowly, exactly how much money are we talking about here? I smiled, feeling more like myself than I had in months. Enough, I said simply. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica's face had gone pale, and I could see her mind working, trying to calculate possibilities, trying to figure out what enough might mean. A few $1,000s? Enough for a nice trip, maybe, but not enough to change anything fundamental. Certainly not enough to threaten her plans for my future. Enough for what exactly? She pressed, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. I walked back to my chair but didn't sit down. Instead, I placed my hands on the back of it, feeling the solid wood beneath my palms. This chair had been Thomas's favorite, the one he sat in every morning while he drank his coffee and read the paper. Now it was mine, and it felt like armor. Enough to live exactly the way I choose to live for the rest of my life, I said. Enough to never have to ask anyone for help unless I want to. Enough to make my own decisions about where I live and how I spend my time. Robert was leaning forward now, his business instincts clearly engaged. Mom, if you've come into some money, that's wonderful. But you need to be careful. You need to talk to a financial advisor. Make sure it's invested properly. These things can be complicated. I almost laughed at the irony. Here was my son, assuming that I was some helpless widow who didn't understand money, when the truth was that I now had more money than he would probably make in his entire lifetime. I've already spoken to several financial advisors. Robert, and lawyers, and accountants. Everything is being handled properly. The casual mention of lawyers and accountants seemed to hit the table like a small explosion. Christopher set down his water glass so hard that some of it sloshed onto the tablecloth. Michael's eyes went wide. Even the grandchildren were paying attention now, sensing that something big was happening, even if they didn't understand what it was. "How much are we talking about, Margaret?" Jessica asked again, and this time there was no pretense of casual curiosity in her voice. This was the voice she used with her real estate clients when she was trying to close a deal, direct and businesslike. I studied her face for a long moment. This woman who had spent the entire dinner trying to convince me to give up my home, who had spoken to me like I was a confused child, who had threatened to abandon me if I didn't comply with her wishes. This woman who had been planning my future like it was hers to plan. "More than enough," I said quietly. "That's not an answer," she snapped, abandoning any pretense of politeness. "If you've inherited some money, we need to know about it. We're your family. We need to help you make smart decisions about it." "No," I said, the word coming out more forcefully than I intended. "You don't need to know about it, and you certainly don't need to help me make decisions about it. What I do with my money is my business." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Jessica's face was flushed with anger now, all traces of her earlier sweetness gone. Robert looked like he was trying to solve a complicated equation in his head. Michael and Christopher were staring at me like they had never seen me before. "Your money," Jessica's voice rose slightly. "Margaret, you're 73 years old. You worked part-time at a library. Your husband was a high school teacher. Where exactly would you get enough money to live independently for the rest of your life?" The question was reasonable, I had to admit. From the outside, it probably did seem impossible that Margaret Davies, librarian and widow, could have suddenly acquired financial independence. But that was exactly what made it so perfect. "I inherited it," I said simply. "From who?" Robert demanded. "Mom, Dad didn't leave that much money. We all know what teachers' pensions look like." "Not from your father," I said. "From my Uncle Harold, my mother's brother. He died in June, and apparently he never forgot about his little niece from Sacramento." I watched as they all tried to process this information. Harold Jameson hadn't been part of their lives, had barely been part of mine. To them, he was just a name mentioned occasionally in old family stories, the uncle who had gone west and never come back. "Uncle Harry?" Christopher said slowly. "The one who used to send you Christmas cards?" "That's the one." Actually, Harold hadn't sent Christmas cards in probably 30 years, but I didn't correct Christopher. It seems he did quite well for himself in California, real estate development, and since he never married, never had children, he left everything to me. The words came out calmly, matter-of-factly, as if I was discussing the weather or the price of groceries, but I could see the impact they were having. Jessica's carefully controlled expression was cracking, revealing something desperate underneath. "How much?" she whispered. I looked around the table one more time, at the faces of my family, at the remains of the Thanksgiving dinner I had spent 2 days preparing. At the centerpiece I had arranged with such care, at the good china that had been my mother's, at the dining room where we had celebrated every important moment of our lives together. $33 million, I said quietly. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. Sarah's mouth fell open. Emma looked up from her phone with genuine shock written across her face. Jake's eyes went wide, like he was trying to count that high in his head. Jessica went completely white. $33 million, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Give or take a few $100,000, I said. "There are also some properties, some investments. The lawyers are still sorting through everything." Robert was staring at me like I had just announced that I was from another planet. "Mom, are you serious? $33 million? "Dead serious," I replied, using one of his father's favorite expressions. Uncle Harold was apparently quite the businessman. Hotels, shopping centers, apartment complexes. He built an empire, and now it's mine. I watched as the implications began to sink in. The woman they had been treating like a helpless burden was now one of the wealthiest people they knew. The mother they had been planning to ship off to a nursing home could probably buy the nursing home. The grandmother whose future they had been deciding was now the one with all the power. Jessica was the first to recover, her real estate agent instincts kicking in. "Well," she said, her voice artificially bright, "that changes everything, doesn't it? I mean, with that kind of money, You could renovate this place, make it completely safe. You could hire a full-time nurse, a housekeeper, whatever you need. You could stay here as long as you want. The sudden reversal was so complete, so transparently self-serving, that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Yes, I said calmly. I could do all of those things. In fact, I probably will do some of them. But the most important thing I can do with this money is something I've already done. What's that? Robert asked. I smiled, feeling a lightness in my chest that I hadn't experienced since before Thomas died. I can stop pretending to need help I don't want from people who don't really want to give it. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread across the table. I had never spoken to my family this directly, this honestly, and the truth of it seemed to reverberate through the dining room. Robert ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood whenever he was trying to process something too big for his understanding. Mom, I can't? $33 million? Are you absolutely certain this is legitimate? These inheritance scams are so sophisticated now, and… Robert, I interrupted gently, I'm not some confused old woman who fell for a phone scam. I've met with Uncle Harold's attorney in person. I've been to the bank. I've seen the properties. I've spoken to accountants and tax advisors and investment managers. This is real. Michael was shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to clear water from his ears. Uncle Harry, I barely remember him. Didn't he used to send you birthday cards? Until about 10 years ago, yes. And Christmas cards with pictures of whatever hotel or shopping center he'd just finished building. I kept them in a shoebox in my closet. I never thought much about them at the time, but apparently he was documenting his success for the little niece who used to sit on his lap when he visited. The image seemed to soften Michael's expression slightly. He was remembering, perhaps, that I had been someone's niece once, someone's little girl, before I became their mother. Why didn't you tell us? Christopher asked. And for the first time all day, he sounded genuinely hurt rather than just uncomfortable. Mom, this is huge. This changes everything. Why would you keep it secret? I looked at my youngest son, the one who had always been most sensitive to the emotional undercurrents in our family, and felt a pang of regret, not for keeping the secret, but for the fact that I had needed to keep it. Because I wanted to see what kind of people you had become, I said quietly. I wanted to know if you would treat me with respect when you thought I had nothing, or if kindness was something you only showed when there was something in it for you. The silence that followed was different from all the others. This wasn't shock or calculation or anger. This was shame, and they all felt it. Christopher's face crumpled slightly. Mom, that's not fair. We love you. We've always loved you. I know you love me, I said, my voice gentler now. But love and respect are different things. Love and kindness are different things. And today, listening to you all discuss my future like I wasn't sitting right here, like my feelings and preferences didn't matter, I realized that somewhere along the way, you had started seeing me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. Carol, who had been silent through most of the conversation, suddenly spoke up. Margaret, I'm so sorry. You're right. We've been talking about you instead of with you, and that's not okay. I nodded gratefully at my daughter-in-law. Carol had always been the kindest of my children's spouses, the one who remembered my birthday without being reminded, who called just to chat sometimes. Jessica, however, was still reeling from the revelation. Her perfectly planned intervention had backfired spectacularly, and she was scrambling to find solid ground in this new reality. Well, this is wonderful news, she said, her voice too bright and too loud. I mean, $33 million. Margaret, you could do anything you want. You could travel the world. You could renovate this house. You could help the family in so many ways. There it was, the real Jessica, the one who saw dollar signs instead of relationships. Even now, even after everything that had been said, she was calculating what this money could mean for her. Help the family how? I asked, genuinely curious to hear her answer. Well, Jessica said, warming to her topic, Robert and I have been looking at a bigger house, something with more room for the kids. And with Emma going to college next year, and Sarah's student loans and, well, there are always family expenses, aren't there? Things that come up. I marveled at her audacity. An hour ago, she had been trying to convince me to move into a nursing home. Now she was already spending my inheritance in her head. Jessica, I said, and my voice carried a warning that she either didn't hear or chose to ignore. "I'm just saying," she continued, "family takes care of family, and now that you have this amazing good fortune, I'm sure you'll want to share it with the people you love most." "The people I love most," I repeated slowly. "Exactly, your children, your grandchildren, the people who care about you and want what's best for you." I stood up again, this time moving to the sideboard where I kept the good silverware that had belonged to my grandmother. I ran my fingers along the smooth surface of the wood, thinking about all the generations of women who had served their families from this piece of furniture. "You know what's interesting, Jessica," I said, not turning around. "An hour ago, you were telling me that I was too old and frail to live in my own home. You were making plans to move me to a nursing home against my wishes. You were threatening to abandon me if I didn't comply with your demands. But now that you know I have money, suddenly I'm capable of making my own decisions. Suddenly my independence is something to be celebrated rather than something to be eliminated." I turned back to face the table, and I could see that my words had hit their mark. Jessica's face was red, her composure finally cracking completely. "That's not... We were just trying to look out for you," she stammered. "No," I said firmly. "You were trying to look out for yourselves. You were trying to solve what you saw as the problem of Margaret, so you could get on with your lives without feeling guilty about neglecting me." The truth of it was written on their faces. Even my sons, who I knew loved me in their own complicated way, couldn't deny what they had been doing. "But here's what you didn't understand," I continued. "I was never your problem to solve. I was never your burden to bear. I was always capable of taking care of myself, and now I have the resources to prove it." I walked back to my chair and finally sat down, feeling calmer than I had in months. The secret was out, the confrontation was over, and for the first time in this entire awful conversation, I felt like I was in control of my own story. "So let me be very clear about something," I said, looking around the table at each of their faces. "I will not be moving to a nursing home. I will not be asking for your help unless I actually need it and actually want it. And I will not be distributing my inheritance to family members who see me as either a burden or a bank account." The silence stretched out between us, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of neighbors arriving home from their own Thanksgiving celebrations. Finally, Sarah cleared her throat. "Grandma Margaret," she said softly, "I think what you did was really smart. And I think some of the things we said today were really unfair to you. I'm sorry." I smiled at my granddaughter, this young woman who was still learning how to navigate the complicated dynamics of family and money and power. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot to me." "So what happens now?" Michael asked quietly. I considered the question carefully. What did happen now? How do you rebuild relationships that had been damaged by assumptions and selfishness? How do you move forward when you've seen the worst in the people you love most? "Now," I said finally, "we finish our Thanksgiving dinner, and then you all go home and think about what kind of family we want to be going forward." The rest of the meal passed in a strange, subdued quiet. People ate mechanically, making small talk about the weather and the football games they planned to watch later. But the easy warmth of earlier Thanksgivings was gone, replaced by something more complex and uncertain. Jessica barely touched her food, pushing the sweet potatoes around her plate like she was trying to solve a puzzle with them. Robert kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part amazement, part embarrassment, part something that might have been pride. When it came time to serve dessert, I brought out the pumpkin pie I had made from scratch, along with the apple crisp that had been Thomas's favorite. The normal rhythm of clearing plates and brewing coffee felt almost surreal after everything that had happened. Emma helped me in the kitchen, stacking dishes in the dishwasher without being asked, her teenage sullenness replaced by something thoughtful and quiet. "Grandma," she said softly as she rinsed the serving bowls, "are you really rich now?" I considered how to answer her. "I have enough money to take care of myself and do the things I want to do," I said finally. "But more importantly, I have enough independence to make my own choices." She nodded like she understood something important, though I suspected she was still trying to work out exactly what had happened at the dinner table. By 6 o'clock, the Thanksgiving gathering was winding down in the way these things always do, with promises to get together soon, discussions of who would take home leftover turkey, and the slightly awkward dance of goodbye hugs. But this year felt different. The hugs were either too brief or too long, and the promises felt hollow. Christopher was the first to leave, pleading an early flight back to Denver. He hugged me tightly at the door, whispering, "I'm sorry, Mom," in my ear before hurrying to his rental car. Michael and Carol stayed to help with the dishes, working quietly and efficiently in a way that felt like penance. When they left, Carol squeezed my hand and said, "We'll call you soon, Margaret. Really soon." Robert and Jessica were the last to go, their departure delayed by Jessica's sudden need to compliment everything about the house: the original hardwood floors, the vintage light fixtures, the amazing potential of the sunroom. It was painful to watch. This woman who had been trying to evict me just hours earlier, now fawning over every detail of my home. "We should have you over for dinner next week," Jessica said as they finally headed toward the door. "I mean, now that we know about your good fortune, we should celebrate properly." "Jessica," I said quietly, stopping her in the hallway beneath the family photos that chronicled decades of holidays and birthdays and ordinary moments. "Nothing has changed except your perception of me. I'm the same woman I was this morning, with the same needs and the same feelings and the same right to be treated with respect." She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand to stop her. "The money doesn't make me more valuable as a person," I continued. "It just makes me less vulnerable to people who would take advantage of that perceived vulnerability." Robert looked like he wanted to say something, but Jessica was already pulling him toward the car, her face flushed with embarrassment or anger or both. When they were finally gone, when the last car door had slammed and the last engine had started, I stood in my front hallway and breathed in the silence. The house felt bigger somehow, and quieter, but not in a lonely way. It felt peaceful. I walked back to the dining room and surveyed the aftermath of the day. The table was cleared, the dishes were done, but the chairs were still arranged in their formal pattern around the empty space where so much had been said and revealed. I thought about all the Thanksgiving dinners that had happened in this room, all the conversations and arguments and laughter that these walls had witnessed. This would be remembered as the Thanksgiving when everything changed, the day when the family dynamics shifted, when assumptions were challenged, when the quiet widow revealed herself to be something else entirely. I picked up the centerpiece I had arranged so carefully that morning and carried it to the kitchen counter. The autumn leaves were already beginning to curl at the edges, their bright colors fading, just as the illusion of family harmony had faded over the course of a single afternoon. That night, I called Mr. Bradley, Uncle Harold's lawyer, even though it was a holiday. He answered on the third ring, probably recognizing my number by now. "Mrs. Davies," he said warmly, "how was your Thanksgiving?" "Educational," I replied, and he chuckled. "Did you tell them about the inheritance?" "I did." "And how did they take it?" I thought about Jessica's face when I said $33 million, about the way my sons had looked at me like they were seeing me for the first time, about Sarah's quiet apology and Emma's thoughtful questions. "About as well as you'd expect," I said finally. "These things have a way of revealing people's true priorities," he said gently. "I've seen it many times in my practice. Money changes relationships, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, but always in ways that show you who people really are." Over the next few days, my phone rang constantly. Robert called to apologize for Jessica's behavior, though he was careful not to criticize his wife too directly. Michael called to ask if I needed help managing my new financial situation. Christopher called from Denver to tell me he'd been thinking about what I'd said and wanted to have a real conversation about our relationship. But it was Sarah's call that meant the most to me. She called on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, while she was driving back to college. "Grandma Margaret," she said, "I wanted to tell you something. What you did on Thursday was really brave. I've been watching Mom treat you like you were, well, like you were less important than the rest of us. And I never said anything because I didn't know how. But you standing up for yourself like that, it made me realize I need to be braver too." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I mean, I need to start speaking up when I see people being treated unfairly, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's family." I smiled, sitting in Thomas's old chair with the phone pressed to my ear and the late November sun streaming through the kitchen windows. "That's the best Thanksgiving gift anyone could have given me," I told her. As for Jessica, I didn't hear from her directly for 2 weeks. When she finally called, her voice was different, smaller, less confident. "Margaret," she said, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. The way I spoke to you, the assumptions I made, it was wrong." I waited, listening to the silence on the line, giving her space to continue. I guess I got so caught up in trying to control everything, trying to plan for every contingency, that I forgot to ask what you actually wanted, and I'm sorry for that. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. Thank you, Jessica, I said. That means a lot. Are we okay? I thought about the question. Were we okay? Could we be okay? Relationships, like bones, sometimes heal stronger after they've been broken, but only if they're set properly. We can be, I said finally, but things are going to be different now. I understand, she said, and for the first time in years, I thought she might actually mean it. The inheritance didn't change who I was, but it changed how people saw me, and maybe more importantly, it changed how I saw myself. I was still Margaret Helen Davies, still a widow who missed her husband, still a mother who loved her complicated children. But I was also a woman with choices, with power, with the freedom to demand the respect I had always deserved. I never did move to Sunset Manor. Instead, I hired a wonderful woman named Rosa, who comes by twice a week to help with the heavier housework. I had the bathroom upstairs renovated with safety features, not because anyone forced me to, but because it seemed like a sensible thing to do. I bought a new car, took a trip to Europe, and donated a substantial amount to the local library where I had worked for so many years. But most importantly, I learned something about the difference between being needed and being valued, between being helped and being controlled. I learned that sometimes the people who love you most can still treat you the worst, not out of malice, but out of their own fears and assumptions. And I learned that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, even if you're 73 years old and sitting at your own Thanksgiving table, surrounded by people who think they know what's best for you. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to stand up to your own family when they were making decisions about your life without consulting you? Please share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to tell me what city you're watching from. Thank you so much for listening until the very end. This is Letters to Helen, and I'll see you in the next story.